Hi, everyone. It's Rabbi Rebecca, and I am here today with Ilana Kurshan, who has come here from Israel, and we are going to talk about her new book, Children of the Book. You can see it here with this beautiful cover with all of these books. It's a book about reading to your children, parenting, all of the many thoughts and feelings that one has as one becomes a parent and as your children grow. And Ilana and I grow way back. And so it's really nice also to be here with someone who I know who wrote a book, which is also an amazing feat. And so that's actually where I want to start, which is I feel like you are the Taylor Swift of books because somehow you wrote a book, you have 5 children, you went through a pandemic, you're living through a war in Israel. And I think we would all like to know how you did that. And but really, like, what inspired you to write this book and write this book at this moment?
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I have to just preface my response by saying that I have twin daughters who are 12, and if they knew that anyone compared me to Taylor Swift, you have no idea.
I mean, she went on a world tour and also recorded 2 albums and got engaged. So that's also great.
Anyway, so I would say that the idea for this book, or perhaps I should say the genesis of this book, it began, I've always been a voracious reader. I've read books my whole life and loved to read. Long before I became a mother, I was an avid reader. And suddenly I had this crisis when my children were born, when my oldest child was born. And I thought to myself, wait a second, how did I just sign on for this full-time job, which is incompatible with what I love most to do, which is to read all the time. And I really struggled with this. I read in the hospital when my son was born, through my contractions. Immediately after my child was born, they placed the baby in my arms and I kept reading aloud from whatever I had been reading. I really sort of am always in the middle of a book. At some point I remember I was still in the hospital after giving birth, and the baby was lying there with eyes wide open, which so rarely happens after a newborn is born because, they're mostly sleeping, and looking at me wide-eyed. And I thought to myself, here I am, like, absorbed in my book. This is so rude. Like, I ought to be paying attention to my child. So I started reading out loud to him whatever it was I was reading. I still remember what I was reading because, of course, it was a very momentous time in my life. But I read aloud to him. And that really started a lifelong, since then, obsession with and passion for reading with and reading to my children. I remember shortly after that, at some point, someone came over to visit the new baby. Someone came over to our home and said, "Oh, so what do you read to the baby?" And I was like, what board books do you have? And I was like, board books? Like, I'm currently reading him a Nobel Prize winning Polish novel, but
That was one of my favorite anecdotes in the book. Where it's that I feel like it's always that way with parenting, where someone's like, "Did you do this?" And you're like, "That completely obvious thing, I didn't do it."
Right, exactly. So I began to read him from, I think, the first book that most parents read to their children, which is some version of a black and white book, where it's just a series of black objects against a white background, or white objects against a black background. And the parent just names like bottle, boat, bath, these familiar objects from the baby's world. And it dawned on me because at the time my child must have been like, all of 2 weeks old or something. He was still mostly sleeping through the days and up all night because, babies can't yet distinguish. Their circadian rhythms haven't developed. And I thought to myself, wow, like, I'm really teaching him how to distinguish black from white, dark from night. And I'm really summoning the world into being for him by naming objects for him on the page. And I thought, that's how God created the world in Genesis, right? God created the world. God's first act in creation was separating light from darkness. And God really called the world into being, summoned the world into being by naming objects. And from there, it really became, I just sort of began to think about so many aspects of the books, my reading life with my children unfolded against the backdrop of Torah. And I really think of the book as very much a threefold braid, weaving together the children's literature I read to my children, many of which are books I read and reread because, of course, children love hearing the same books over and over, whether it's the same 2 books, the same 5 books. And then also because as Jews, we are always also in the middle of reading the same 5 books,
Yes.
namely the 5 books of the Torah. So I wove in also the Torah that we Jews are always reading, and the third strand being what was happening in the life of our family.
There were so many moments in the book where you compared a children's book that I loved to a story in the Torah. And I went, wow, I never thought about it like that. Like, yes, of course, those two stories are related and connected.
Mm,
And I think sometimes, especially living in the United States, your Jewish life and your Jewish reading and your English
mm,
life and your English reading
mm.
can feel very separate.
Yes.
And I know you live in Israel where those things potentially are
Mm,
more woven together, but
mm.
for people who are feeling like, I'd love to infuse more Jewish life or Jewish literature into my world, how would you help people start to see and build those
Yeah,
connections?
yeah. It's a great question because it is true that I think so much of the modern world encourages us to compartmentalize the various aspects of our lives, and that is part of the reason I love living in Jerusalem, because you walk in the streets and you see like the billboards are filled with advertisements for rabbis giving shiurim, new parsha classes. Like you really feel like you're living in a culture that is so steeped in Jewish learning and Jewish texts and Jewish life. So I think part of it is definitely living in Jerusalem has helped a lot. But I think also realizing that as Jews, no matter what other books we are reading at any given point in time, we are also all always in the middle of reading the Torah because of the way Jews read Torah, which is as part of a liturgical cycle where we start every fall with the book of Genesis and conclude the following fall with the book of Deuteronomy and immediately resume again. And if we pay attention to where we are in the liturgical cycle and we read the weekly Torah portion as we are supposed to do, right? Then it's always like we always have one foot or one ear in the text, in the text of the Torah, because that's always where we are. And so I think it happens more organically that life seems to unfold against the backdrop of that text because we're always in the middle of reading it. So I think that some of it is just in attunement to what our liturgy offers us and what the Jewish calendar offers us, what the cycle of the calendar offers us, which is the opportunity to always be, to always be, for life to always be unfolding against a sacred rhythm and to attune ourselves to that rhythm.
Yeah. And I think there's so much that parents can do, especially with things like PJ Library or, joining your synagogue community to
Yeah,
really
yeah,
have that be a part of your
yeah,
life, that you
yeah.
don't have to, as you were doing, like reading in Hebrew from the Torah so that
Right,
your kids would
right,
go to sleep because you were
right.
trying to bore them to
Yes,
sleep.
yes,
I love that story
yes.
too. But that, that parents can kind of learn that those rhythms
Yes.
along with their
Yes.
kids.
And yes, part of what I have tried to do is to teach my children that I don't think that sacred and secular literature are as separate as we think of them. Like it's true, I do read Parsha with my children. In fact, I was actually just reading with my son this past Shabbat right before I came to America on this trip. I flew Saturday night, but on Shabbat afternoon, I was reading with my son from a beautiful illustrated Parsha book by an Israeli writer named Emily Amrusi. The series is now in English. I actually
Oh,
translated
great.
it. I really
Amazing.
recommend it. We should get it for the library here. It's wonderful. But anyway, I was reading to him, because we're at the beginning of the Torah right now. I was reading to him the opening parshiot in the book, and he stopped me at one moment and he said, "Wait a second, Ima." And he flipped to the front of the book. He said, "Who wrote this?" And I told him the name of the author, Emily Amrusi, this Israeli journalist. And he said to me, he looked crestfallen. He said, "Oh, I thought it was Hashem. I thought it was God." And I thought to myself, oh, that just says it all. And okay, so clearly you have those associations when you're reading, Torah, sacred text. But whenever I'm reading with my children, also books that are not, just ordinary picture books, or whatever it is, we're reading chapter books, I'm always trying to sensitize them to parallels between sacred text and secular text. And that was sort of the germ for a lot of what came up in the book. I'll often ask them as we're reading together, like, what does this remind you of when Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim invokes the merit of her husband in order to ask for help from the rats, right? What does this remind you of? We do this as Jews every time we daven the Amida prayer, right? We start by saying we invoke our ancestors, Zchut Avod, and we say to God, we're coming before you by the merit of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's like what Mrs. Frisbee is doing. That is to say, I'm always trying to help my children to come up with those associations and make those connections for themselves because for me they happen very naturally.
Yeah. And I think that sort of the way you describe the reading time, it comes across as feeling very sacred, even if you're reading sort of maybe a more secular book, but it comes across as feeling like very important time in your family. I was wondering if it's like as ideal as it seems in the in the book when everyone's reading together nice and quietly, and like, can you teach me how to do that in my house, please?
It's funny because people have said to me, you know, like, wow, I wish I could read with my kids as much as you. And the truth is, I don't see it as sort of something aspirational. I see it as more of a coping strategy. Like, because if I didn't read at the table while my kids were eating, they would be bickering constantly. They stealing food off each other's plates, who got more dessert. You know, like I read as a coping mechanism, as a parenting strategy to like distract my kids. You know, it's not really like this, you know, the way you describe it is far too glorious. I will say there is a lot of reading that really does happen in my house at all times of day. I'll just share with you a funny anecdote. Also, literally, I am not making this up. It's from the same past Shabbat, because those I forget stories. That's why I have to write, because if I didn't write, I would forget everything. But this is also from, you know, 3 days ago on Shabbat, and Shabbat afternoon in my home, the day I flew. My twin daughters, who are now 12, they were younger in the book. They had a friend over, a friend that they've been very close with since they were in preschool, since they were 3 years old, and they're not in the they're very, very close friends. They've stayed in touch over the years, and the friend. I was telling her I would be going to America to talk about my book. And this friend said, wow, that's so cool. What is your book about? I told her, and she said, I remember when you finally let us have our first sleepover when we were 5.5, and you read to us that scary, scary book with the dead woman. And I was like, what are you talking about? Turns out it was a picture book called The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco, which indeed, though this is hardly the focus of the book in any way, there is one illustration of a woman on her deathbed. This apparently is what struck with her. And I went to get the book just to show them, because I knew which book she meant. And the 3 girls sat there at the Shabbos table, like this, their heads in the book together, reading every page and like remembering their associations with this book from when I had read it to them, you know, 7 years ago. So that was a more idyllic moment. There are moments like that, but there are also the moments where it's like, okay, how are we going to stop this tantrum? What book can I start reading to very, very quietly, in the hope that y'all quiet down and listen up? You know, there's more than just the, you know, glamour shots.
It's amazing, like what sticks with you from the book, because I have this vivid memory of, you know, the story with the woman who wears the green ribbon around her neck, and then at the end she takes it off and her head falls off. Right? I have this like. I can see that book. I can see all the words. I can see all the pictures. It was read to me, or I read it when I was too young for that story.
Right.
But it is amazing how some books can just like,
they become indelible.
Stay with you. And I actually see it right over here next to me. There's this book called Rosie's Walk, which my uncle will tell you, when I was 2 years old, he would read to me about 100 times a day. I was the only grandchild / niece until my sister came along and, you know, ruined everything.
Right.
But whenever I see him, we often end up talking about this book, which has basically no plot. It's about a hen who goes for a walk, and yet it's just such a part of our family story and our family lore. And when my son was born, he bought a copy of this book so I could read it to Simon, who probably doesn't remember it, because I don't think it made quite the same impression on him as apparently it did on 2-year-old me.
Right. It's so interesting how books can play such important roles in the relationship between parent and child, or uncle and child, you know, in this case, because you know, I think that we often think of books, we often make the mistake of thinking that children's books are scripts for recitation, but really I think they're more meant to be prompts for connection. Like, you read a book with a child and you pause and you listen to what are the child's associations, what are the child's questions, what are they thinking at any point in time. And often the book you're reading, apropos this case of, you know, my son and his question about who wrote the book, right? The book you're reading is very different from the book they're hearing. And if you take the time to explore that fertile abyss between what you're reading and what they're hearing, or that fertile disparity, that gap, it's just so rich what you discover about yourself, about the book, and about your child.
Yeah, I don't have any statistics on this piece of information, but I would imagine our society reads less now than we did before phones and screens and all of that. And I suspect that our lack of reading is leading to people's inability to hold nuance, to have difficult conversations, to do all these things that you're talking about, right? Even if you have two people reading a book, they can hear and see different things and hopefully talk about it, as opposed to the world where we live in now, where we're talking to a screen as opposed to a book / another person.
Yes, first of all, there are statistics.
I'm sure there are. I just don't have
a study
them
very recently about this, so which I would not know about, except for the fact that I just wrote a book about it, and people send me this article because I wrote a book about it. But anyway, yes, there have been actually very recently several studies about the decline in reading to children specifically, let alone also of course adult reading, because one influences the other. But I will say that I think that a lot of what reading teaches children, which screens really, I think, convey the opposite message. Like with a screen provides instant gratification. You push the button, the screen lights up. It's like, I always think of it like the story of the golden calf. Like the Israelites were waiting at the foot of the mountain. They could no longer handle waiting for Moses to come back. They were anxious. They were nervous. Was Moses late? Where was Moses? He said he was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. He's supposed to come back from God. So what do in their anxiety and their nervousness? They give up. They build this golden calf. They want to be able to see and touch the object of their worship. They need a screen. They need something that's going to light up and flash before them, and on the other hand, when we read a book, which of course I am analogizing to Moses and Mount Sinai receiving the book of the Torah, right? The book, right? When we read a book, any book, what we have to do is we have to imagine, right? We don't have the full visual detail before us, even in a picture book, but all the more so in books for older readers, chapter books, right? You have to conjure the scene for yourself. Very often books begin in media res. You don't know what happened just before, right? Like, who would want to read a children's book, a chapter book that begins with, this is a story about a family that has 3 children. The oldest child is named, the second, like, it would get boring.
Yeah.
Instead it starts with Ben rushed in the door, threw his backpack on the ground, or whatever. You start in the action because you want to get right swept up in the story, which means that as the reader, there's a lot of the discomfort of not knowing, not being sure, waiting at the foot of the mountain. What is this exactly about? And I think it is so important in an age of screen technology to teach children the value of sitting with uncertainty, especially, now in an age where every question we might have, it often seems like, is just one AI chat or one perplexity question away. Like, what's the capital of Venezuela? You don't even have to think about it for a second. You just, type it into your computer and the computer will answer you. What's a good recipe for cheesy pasta? No problem. Type it in. You'll get 1 million from allrecipes.com or whatever, right? But the hardest questions in life do not have easy answers. Do not, like questions like, what do I want to be when I grow up? What are my strengths and talents? How can I make the world a better place, right? Those are not questions that any screen can answer for you. And if we teach children to think that every question has, an instantaneous answer, that everything just lights up and comes back at you, then we're denying children, that's such an important lesson about what it means to live your way into the answers.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about my favorite passage in the book. And I think it's my favorite because I also was reading it when my oldest son, he's a senior in high school and he's getting ready to apply to college. And so I took a picture of it and I'm like sending it to all my friends. And I was like, then there was like crying, obviously. So, at the end, this is actually right at the end of your Shemot, at the end of your Exodus chapter, you're talking about sort of, you write, our children's journey to freedom and independence, like their journey to independent reading, is a journey away from us. But we can furnish our children with the associations that matter to us. And I just want to tell you that those 2 sentences and the whole paragraph meant so much to me, because I feel like that's the whole, see, now I'm going to cry here on this video. But that I think is like really the essence of parenting, is to not force our children into our image, but to give them enough that like they want to be in our image, for lack of a better word. And so I was wondering, for you, are there things where like you're like, you know what, I don't think my kid should read this book, or are there no books that they can't read? How do you help guide them in a way that doesn't feel, especially with books, that doesn't feel like you can do this and you can't do this, and you can do this and you can't do this, or I need you to come out exactly like me, but still in your image.
Yeah. I'll say that part of the reason I continue to read out loud to my children, even long after they're perfectly capable of reading to themselves now, both in Hebrew and in English.
That's very impressive.
Yes. It was an uphill battle, but the English, but yes. But part of the reason I keep reading aloud to my children is because if I just left them to read whatever they wanted to read, like, they wouldn't necessarily read the books I want them to read. Like, my daughters would probably read mostly Emily Henry romance novels, which I have nothing against, certainly not. I don't want to say that on television, I have nothing against her, but, I'd love for them to also be reading other kinds of literature. My son would just read What If over and over, which is a book of serious scientific answers to absurd hypothetical questions. Is his favorite book.
Yes, we have these
every
books.
Parent of a boy
Yes.
seems to know that book or whatever. Anyway, so part of the reason I read to them is because it's important to me, especially as an American citizen, right? I want, and someone who was raised in a rich English-speaking literary tradition, I want my children to grow up with so many of the books that were so formative for me and instilled in me such a deep love of reading. So I read to them A Wrinkle in Time, Little Women, Little House on the Prairie, The Phantom Tollbooth, like all the books that were part of my canon, but which are not part of the canon of my children who are being raised in Israel, and where their education, at least in school, is exclusively in Hebrew. In fact, I'll share with you that my daughter called me yesterday. I was in between book things, and she called me here and said, I have to do a book report for school, and this is the book they assigned to me. Do you think it's a good book? Do you know anything about it? And I was like, I'm sure I don't know, because what do I know about young adult Hebrew literature? I didn't grow up in Israel. I mean, I read a lot in Hebrew, but I read adult novels. I didn't have that, I didn't go through that stage of life in this culture. And she says to me, the title is Ga'ava v'deot k'dumot. And I said to her, oh my gosh, do you mean Pride and Prejudice? Sure enough, it was Pride and Prejudice in Hebrew.
Oh, that's amazing.
I said to her, you are not allowed to read that book in Hebrew, and you are not allowed to start it without me. I'm reading that with you. So in terms of being an overbearing, I am not a helicopter parent in any way, except when it comes to my children's reading, where I really like to be involved. I am the opposite of the helicopter parent. I'm super Israeli in that sense. But I was like, we're reading the first chapter together. I know the beginning by heart, and so does every
I'll just recite it to you on the phone right now.
I did.
Oh my gosh.
It is the truth. Anyway, I won't recite it now. But anyway, I had to I had to convey to her my excitement about the book. For the most part, I don't limit the books my kids can read. I tend to believe that all reading is good reading. And I also really believe that kids have their own filters, and they really, I believe, they understand only as much as they're able to assimilate. And when there's something that they don't fully, that's when there are difficult truths, they somehow manage to come up with their own way of modulating those truths. At least I think so. I actually remember, apropos of reading Torah with my children. So yes, I write about this in the book, that at night when my younger kids can't fall asleep, I chant to them from the Torah as a way of, because I chant from the Torah regularly. I always need to practice, and you have to repeat the same verses again and again. It's deadeningly boring to the auditor, so they'll just fall asleep. And I remember one night I was chanting to them from Parshat Acharei, because that was the Parsha, and I was up to the part about, a man may not lie with his sister, a man may not lie with his mother, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I really hope my daughter's asleep by now, because this is not the most appropriate. And then she interrupts me. She wasn't asleep, and she says to me, Ima, Mom, I'm so happy you're lying with me right now. And I thought to myself, you never know what kids are thinking. No. So, I think to some extent, we don't really, I don't think, need to censor for our children, because they censor for themselves, and they find their way to the truths when they're mature enough to handle them.
Yeah. No, I think that is a really important thing that reading can provide, right? Mm-hmm. Because as you said, we don't always have the pictures, and so they can construct a picture in their minds that is kind of appropriate for where they are.
Well said. Yes.
So I just want to really say to anyone who is watching this, and to our community, that I think this is such a beautifully written book, and is so accessible, whether you know and have a lot of Jewish background or don't have a lot of Jewish background. Because as I was reading it, and granted I have a lot of Jewish background, the thing that really stood out to me was all of your listing of all of the books that you love. And I was like, I love that book too, and that book too, and that book too. And I remember reading that book, and I remember reading that book. And, you know, my kids' shelves are full of picture books because I refuse to get rid of them, even though my youngest is almost 11.
Yeah, I understand.
And that's why I love to come to this library, because we have all these cute pictures. But where can people get this book, and how can they help you promote this message about reading to children, which is really so important?
Well, thank you. So at this point, I think you can get it anywhere except in Israel, because I'm having it will come to Israel.
Will it be translated into Hebrew, or?
I don't know. My last book was translated into Hebrew, so you know, one can hope, but we'll see. I don't know yet.
Did you translate your own book, since you work as a translator?
I did not. However, I do translate. I am a translator, but I translate exclusively from Hebrew to English. Oh, okay. That said, I worked very closely with a translator. I had never met her before. She was hired by the publisher. She works for the publisher, the Israeli publisher, but she and I loved working together on the book so much. It really became like a chavruta. It was our study partnership.
Oh, that's so nice.
And then when we finished the book, we felt bereft. Like, well, how are we going to see each other? We were meeting once a week. I was like, how are we going to see each other? So we started reading Agnon together. And we have an Agnon chavruta, studying Shai Agnon's book. So we were able to continue the chavruta. But anyway, but yes, you can get the book anywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your independent bookstore, what have you. And in terms of what can be done to support the book, if you do read it and you enjoy it, the most helpful thing, I think, is to write a customer review on Amazon, or, you know, some online feedback where other readers will see it and hopefully find their way to the book would be very much appreciated. So thanks for asking.
Well, thank you for being here, and for stopping by Central and stopping by our library on your way. We felt it was really the most appropriate place to talk about this book, was to be surrounded by the books that we read to our children here at Central. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.